Welcome everyone to this latest edition of Print Speak. My name is Rebecca Travis and I'm the Curator and Collections Manager here at Open Studio. We are very excited to have Isabel Diana joining us today with their talk entitled A Visual Practice of Lived Experience. And you can see Isabel's fantastic feature wall installation just behind me here in the gallery. Before we begin, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. Open Studio acknowledges that it is situated on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee, who are the original owners and custodians of the land on which we continue to create and exist. I'll start with a little bit about Open Studio and Print Speak. Open Studio is an artist-run center dedicated to contemporary print. We offer accessible, inclusive, and affordable printmaking facilities, programs, and services for artists and the public across Canada and abroad. We support artists in creating and exhibiting contemporary print in an open-minded, safe, and collaborative environment. Our vision is to shape the exploration of print as essential, dynamic, and relevant to contemporary culture and creative thought. Print Speak is a virtual education series that focuses on the incredible artists whose work pushes the boundaries of print media. These talks will take you on a journey with each artist to learn about their passion for creating. A bit about Isabel Diana. Thank you so much for joining us. Isabel Diana is a Canadian-Colombian artist currently located in Portland, Oregon. They received their BFA from Ontario College of Art and Design University in Toronto and are now an MFA Print Media Candidate at Pacific Northwest College of Art at Willamette University. Isabel was adopted from Colombia at 3 months old and grew up in Hamilton, Ontario, with a Brazilian mother and a French-Canadian father, the perfect balance between North and South American upbringing. Their identity as an adoptee strongly influences their work by exploring identity nuances. Their practice focuses on lived experience through imagery, pattern, and text, and the work is bright and full of life, created using techniques of layering through printmaking. Over to you, Isabel.
Thank you. All right. Well, yeah. Thank you all for coming today. I'm going to just try to jump right into it, keep it alive, keep it going. So I'm just going to share my screen. Awesome. So the kind of presentation artist talk that I'm going to be sharing today is half on like the journey and process of making, which is a part of my practice I don't talk about as much often, but I have discovered some amazing new techniques that I think are just like great to share and like bring into new spaces, as well as the work that's in Toronto specifically, as well as what is currently in Portland, which I defended and passed really beautifully on Tuesday. So yeah, there'll be a lot kind of going on, but hopefully it'll feel full circle. Let's see. So my studio. So this is a corner of my studio where I've kind of tried to bring some things with me from my undergrad in Toronto, as well as new explorations that kind of maybe represent me as the maximalist that I am, and the kind of mess that I like to enjoy around me just for creativity, as well as acknowledging a bit more of my identities. So I am identify as Latina. I am she, her pronouns. I am adopted, mixed. I'm a mixed child in the world of being raised by two parents who have different backgrounds as well. And we kind of come together to meet in the middle. I also have a ton of dietary restrictions. I'm gluten-free and I have severe IBS. So I also consider myself a chronically ill body with chronic migraines as well. And I am neurodiverse. I have learning disabilities. I struggle in processing information. So I am an extremely visual learner and visual person, so I must see everything to know it exists in the world around me. So that's kind of why my studio is often like so filled with objects, just because I need to remember everything constantly, and I try to like have that to me. So open shelving is my dream in all spaces. And then, yeah, this is kind of like, I would say, the perfect explanation of who I am. I love fruit to the core of my being. I could eat fruit every day. Um, and trying to bring that into maybe more refined practice was kind of like, how do we work with the things we love? And that's kind of this kind of beginning step of maybe the lived experience and the visual practice of the lived experience. So for myself, I identify as a fruit salad because of like the mix of North and South that happens in fruit salads. And so trying to then break it down into like, okay, well, what can fruits represent? What aspects of my identity can they each stand for? So we came up with this idea of identity crisis as a fruit salad, as this like welcoming image into what my exploration has strongly been in the last year. And then, let's see, process. So last year, I was really privileged enough to kind of decide I wanted to make wallpaper. The decision came really from the beginning of everything that has culminated in the last 3 years when we think of our society and how the global majority have been placed in these categories to take up space, to be proud of who we are, but also constantly challenging the white supremacy, like performative act that is put upon us, and the tokenization and kind of all that language was really struck with me. My last year at OCAD, I did a whole project that was life-size portraits of myself. And I didn't feel comfortable after I left that space. I didn't feel as though people had actually seen me. They just saw a brown body. And so that really left me in a space of reflecting on who am I, what am I, and what is my visual language? And the visual language doesn't have to be your body. It was such like a breaking, like such a eye-opening moment to like, I can express myself so differently, and I can express myself for how I see myself. And so that's kind of where this idea of bringing what I love, which is the home, into space. So the space that I've created is like still very unknown to me. They're still very open-ended, kind of like, as you can see the gallery wall, a space can be anywhere and home can be anywhere. So using these wallpapers and the techniques of repeat patterning through silk screening, this table specifically is made for fabric. So taking that to then transfer it to paper and work with paper on it was no one had seen it done like that at the school, which I thought was really exciting. So I worked with also the ideas of sustainable practice. So the paper I use is actually a Craft Kids paper from IKEA. It holds ink really well, and you can buy it in really large rolls for like about $4. So thinking about how much we put into our practice, it was kind of important for me to like be financially conscious, especially for something that in truth is not keepable after removal. And that's just something to consider when wheat pasting and when kind of going down this route of imagery. Yeah, so this is kind of like the process of putting the wheat paste up. You can kind of see on the side, there's a close-up of the pattern, and then this is the current space in Portland, and this is kind of as I was beginning. And you can also see how it was transferred and how much like kind of you lose and the colors disappear when it's like so compressed. This was actually a risograph, which was also interesting to explore and just like continuing creating outside the institution. Other way. And then this is the sidewall that accompanies it. And so on left, you have my original drawing and kind of seeing how that changed to a 1-color pattern instead of a 4-color pattern, and using the printing process to change the coloring. Kind of like another way to view how you can begin with something and change it and adapt it for spaces. And also gridding it in a different way with 2 colors. And then this is the one in Toronto, which is behind Rebecca. So you can see it started as an extremely digital pattern, but through the bit mapping and through the transferring of ink and using the CMY process, so cyan, magenta, and yellow to layer, you can also play with how much transparency each of those colors have. So it plays with the lights and the darks, and kind of like, once again, having a moment of like expression and, you know, living and being present with work. It changes as you touch it. And so I think that's really something beautiful that happens during the printing process for myself. And then kind of like a bit of kind of the journey of how these things get created. It does take a bit of math. So this was me planning out how many would the wall need, because they are placed like tiles. So I think it's really interesting to like consider the fact that after they are printed, they're all personally trimmed, then they are installed. So it is like a kind of 3-point process. And then, yeah, getting into kind of a bit more of what is in both spaces and what projects and kind of moments of trying to acknowledge the lived experience with the visual, with the language, and trying to meet in the middle. I created a series of takeaways, which are present in both spaces, but it is also the access point to kind of this digital immersion of like meeting in the middle. And taking a bit of the imagery and a bit more of the collage aspects of my practice. And so these are 3 of the 4. The 4th one is here. And this is what the backside of each of these postcards is. It's a text block, each different for each of them, and a QR code that takes you to the website, which currently, if you go directly to, you'll see the Toronto work, just because it recently, it was first activated in Toronto, kind of the QR codes. And then right now, it is a point where the people in Portland can see what's happening in Toronto as I'm like going through the defense and presenting the work here. And then that's the QR code. I'll like stop it for a second if anyone wants to like scan it, look at it later. But yeah, so I don't know where people are viewing things. I didn't think of that one, but I can also put the link in the chat at the end. But this is kind of some of the information that's on the website. So there's a bit of description pages. It's actually a 3-pone page. So there's an info page. There's the page that you scanned to access. And then there's also a Portland page. And it's currently in the sneak peek phase just because I'm like, have not as much time as I thought I would have recently, but it will be fully updated hopefully in the next 2 weeks with all the information, as the paper just got approved to accompany this work. Yeah, and so kind of looking more at the installations, kind of how this work comes together, the creative process and creating work and that emergence is very generative, and I create a lot very fast, and then it kind of comes to these spaces where I begin the conversation of, well, what does this wall need? What actually needs to be present in this space? What is full? What is balanced? And I don't think a lot of that happens before. I'm not a planner in that way. So that's kind of the close-up of the middle wall. And then these are the 3 images more close up, and you can see a lot more of the detail. There are 3 silk screens there. I consider them a triptych at this point. It's an edition of 5, and these are 3 of the prints in that edition. It is a varied edition, but there's a lot of overlaying and different explorations of paper and color and ink. I'm really drawn to neons and brights, but also trying to, you know, acknowledge the balance of what an eye can handle, what visually is overwhelming. So pairing these 3 together was really exciting to like explore overlays and monoprinting as well, primarily. And yeah, transitioning a bit into Portland, which is probably new to a lot of you, and explaining a bit more of that journey. So the Portland space was installed about, I'm gonna say at this point, we're 7 days ago was our last day of installation, or we've had about 7 days. So very much the same relationship as of how the process went in Toronto, of doing the wall first and then sitting with the wall for a moment and then deciding what the space needs. So it was quite empty at first. It was just the walls and the frames. And then, so very interestingly, when I was in Toronto, the minute I brought the frames, I thought the wall was so full already. And I was like, it filled up so fast. And then when I came to Portland and I brought the frames into the space, I was like, oh my, it's very empty. And I think that's kind of acknowledging the lived experience and like having one experience and thinking this is how all things go, but having to realize visual practices is just like life. Like you have to adapt and you have to change, and one experience might not influence the next one completely. So even though I felt extremely prepared because I was like, I just did this in Toronto, I understand what's going to happen, it was not the same. And all of that is also installation-based work is so site-specific, and it changes so much based on the environment and the space you're in. So after putting the wallpaper up, I repurposed those plants from the gallery. I asked them if I could borrow them, and I started bringing all my chairs from my studio. So as you can see, there's like a journey of things added, and I spent $80 at Target just buying beach things. I was like, because it needs to feel activated. And it was the realization of like, as a transnational person, I don't have those objects with me, but I feel them inside me. So being conscious of like, what do I need to bring to people for them to like feel as though I feel. And you can kind of see how the prints are arranged. You can recognize one of them from Toronto. And this is kind of like the expanded body of the series that is Finding Comfort in the Crisis. And then moving into this kind of small activation that was really like important to me, which was the kitchen, and creating a space of the kitchen table and stuff. And the plates on the wall were, I kind of have one of them here. This is like a earlier mock-up, but they were kind of my living sketchbook for the year. I didn't really have a sketchbook, but I was also needing a place to express myself and kind of work away from these such repeated patterns constantly and reclaim myself and reclaim my space and reground myself. So I started doing these plates last year and I gave them all away for people for Christmas. And then I felt so silly because I was like, I feel like I need them back. So I worked on like rebuilding that collection of plates. They're Posca markers on bisqued plates. And they kind of were like a continuous project throughout the whole year that felt really important to this conversation of what home feels like to me and what are my safe places. And that's a lot, like if anyone's ever curious, a lot of what my paper explored through my MFA thesis completion was kind of these spaces you give yourself and you find yourself in to find comfort. And I think that's, you know, being able to express it and draw it and recreate it for yourself is where I see my visual language and my visual practice as. So these are some of the close-ups of the prints, very exciting. A lot of what the visual language and lived experiences for me is in collaboration with my childhood. I work and create my childhood and reframe my childhood and for a social context as well as just being like as Rebecca mentioned in my intro, I'm adopted. I was adopted at 3 months old. And so a part of what I try to reframe and reflect to society is that my childhood was beautiful, and the idea of adoption trauma and how that comes into my lived experience happened much older. But I think it's important to acknowledge like you need a beautiful childhood and you need those moments of comfort to be able to handle what you're experiencing later in life. And as well as like, I believe there needs to be two parts of your practice, one part that's personal and for you and one part that's for the public, and trying to merge it in these like, in these installations, in these different spaces. Like, I don't really expect let's say like people to purchase baby prints of me and put them in their home. I think that's a little creepy, quite honestly. But, you know, I try to open that conversation of like, well, what is life? What is lived? When was this lived? How was it lived? And so Miss Summer Baby Girl is kind of just this more like fun, free energy of just like being a silly kid, like. And pattern, I think pattern comes out so much of that age when we're a child, of like the clothes we wore and, you know, how we interact with things. And then Miss Worldwide is, I think, one of the most iconic childhood pictures I have. There's something so unexpected also in looking back on your childhood imagery and you didn't think you were sassy, you just thought you were being, and like reclaiming that imagery now is like, oh, I was like a sassy, bad young one. Like that's what that was, because that's how I see it now. And overlaying that on a collection of images that I've shot over the last, I would say, 5 years or so, from going to the orphanage I was adopted from for the first time, to just dinners in the park, to my aunt's backyard, to the winter snow in Quebec, where my dad's family is, to a trip that my class did to Mexico right before COVID started, to my birthday, to living in Switzerland, to like small town in Canada, like all, as well as like greenhouses from different cities in the world. All of these I've taken, and I've really taken on a transnational identity through my travels and through like this idea of exploration of the world. And I've spent, I guess, extended periods of time in more different places than most people my age. So I think bringing that into acknowledgement as like, that is privilege, that is identity, but that also plays such a big part in how I'm able to perceive the world. Continuing on. And then these are the two other prints. The Black print that was kind of seen in one of the frames, maybe would not have expected that all this information and content is on that piece of paper. This image is actually more of on gray tone paper, so you can really see it a lot. I wanted to be able to provide you, I know digital impairs so much of what you're able to experience, so at least giving you a better experience into the print. And so this was a pattern I created last semester. I don't even know where it is. Oh, it's right here. It was a wood block, actually, that was laser cut. And it's this really interesting exploration that I started of, can your practice be visual and vibrant if there's no color? So I worked with blind embossment and kind of continued that exploration after I really got a lot of positive feedback of, yeah, it still holds everything you express about your practice, even if there's no color left. So when I came into like my thesis body of work specifically, I really wanted to talk about identity crisis in the frame of your body and society. And so for myself, that was my Black hair, and how my relationship to my Black hair is something that I've had to like reclaim and learn to love and take steps of work towards. And so I did Black on Black because I really struggled on how to express it. So the text block in the middle explains the whole story. And then the external is kind of my language and my way of speaking and expressing myself to kind of put these dualities together. And also there's a thread of kind of reclaiming the colonizer's language, but also questioning the colonizer's language and choosing when to use it. So that's why this this installation and all this work has a primarily more visual pattern-based language rather than a written language. And the written language is the things that are harder to access. So they're on the back of the postcards, they're hidden within the print, they're accessible through a QR code. There's these steps that need to be taken to access them, was a really important step for myself as I moved into kind of this idea of like the lived experience in motion. And the other print on the side was kind of me going back to my love of fruits. You put the lime in the coconut and shake it all up. Also, I just really started to realize how that text played so directly into intersectionality, and how like putting that together was such like a random, unexpected like exploration, but came together so perfectly as like childhood and joy, and really like my South American roots, and kind of like a really expression of like, that's what my childhood looked like. And yeah, and then motifs of color, and just like approaching it as a silkscreen project and how kind of color works within that world. And then kind of a close-up of the plates that are currently in the space. And they're all unique. They're Posca markers, as I mentioned before, and they each happened on a different day, probably in a different moment, but it was a really enjoyable thing to continuously add to, and also like as one marker ran out, going and purchasing a new marker that had a bit of a different tone to it, and like continuing that language. And I think for sure a definite project that I see myself continuing, and also hoping to learn how to make these food safe, because they're not currently. So I'm really curious about that journey and like a material study. And then a bit more of my material studies and the materials in the space. I got really into like acrylic laser cutting to bring text into the space. And when you peel these, they're actually clear. And I think that's really exciting because they hide into the wallpaper. And so I think that like intersection of hiding things and what's present, what's like right there in front of you, but you can't really reach, I think plays into like the lived experience so much, and what like coding in the self and all that. So yeah, and then on the other side is really more a direct language to home. It's one of my tufted pieces that's in the space. And I began tufting in the last 2 years, and have really enjoyed just like the comfort and the care and the gentle hands that I think are just like so obvious when you look at a tufted piece, and how that relates back to like the history of the home and what it means to create a home. Then I think carpets are such an important language of those spaces, and like the carpets you choose to put in your space, I think really define how you want it to feel. Like, do you have a really colorful carpet that's soft, or is it, you know, more something that's like a doormat that's really harsh, but it's for cleaning? So really curious about that intersection and just, you know, being more conscious of what it means to create home and create space. Yeah, thank you for your time. That's kind of all I have presentation wise. I do have a walkthrough video of the space that I'm going to come out of this screen share and pull up quickly. That's for me.
That was great. Thank you, Isabel. It was great to see the space in the video sweep through as well. Thank you. So we'll open it up for questions. As I mentioned before, you're welcome to put them into the chat, or you can put your hand emoji up and we'll answer there. I had a question just sort of to kick things off, which was just to ask a bit more about the writing side of your practice. And I thought it was really interesting to hear you say that, like, in terms of the viewer accessing the writing, there's always a couple more steps to go through for them to get there. But I wondered how you use writing sort of in your day-to-day studio practice, and how it sits along all of that like visual information that you're always kind of working with.
Yeah, totally. It is such a big step, writing, and it's really interesting where it happens in my process. I often, you know, start thinking of these ideas of like, wow, I really want to do a wallpaper. I really want to do this thing, draw a tufted piece, or create a print about something. And then I normally sit down at that time to write and to do these, what you'll find on the postcard, which is a reflection, and kind of think about like, what is at the core of my identity am I struggling with right now? What is this like two intersections that are coming together? And then from that moment, I think whatever is written really like explains what happens next. And I think Remember the Sun, Baby Girl, that's currently in Toronto, is such a good example of that, because I hadn't thought of the shape of the sun. I hadn't really thought of those things until I'd written and realized how much of a motif for freckles it was. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of that is like generative from the writing and comes in the next phase.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was going to ask about the sun motif as well. Just, I know that it is present through a lot of the work. Laura has a question as well. She says, you offered a lot of insight into the process of installing the work and adaptability, as well as personal lived experience. What, if any, processes or thoughts do you go through when taking the work down?
I haven't gotten there yet. I've only ever taken one of these types of installation down was last year for my first year show. And it was also my first time wheat pasting a gallery space. So I think I was so in fear of ruining the space because I didn't know what was going to happen, that I think I didn't really allow myself to really reflect on that moment. And it was also a very different time because of COVID, no one actually saw the work. We installed, but it wasn't open to the public. So I think for this time around, I've really come to terms after doing that, knowing that it will come apart. Like I tried to save as much as I could, but because of the material I use, like it's not, the wallpaper itself is not salvageable. But I also think that's why I am a silk screener. I can really recreate it if needed. And I plan everything to be so site specific that, you know, its life is when it's in that space. And that's truly how I believe it.
I guess that goes with part of that like lived experience. It's almost like the work has its life as well.
100%. I think I also, as printmakers, like we are hoarders sometimes. So knowing that like, oh, I don't have to keep this, like it's kind of satisfying as well.
It's quite freeing, I guess. We have a question from Chris. They say, great job, Izzy. I'm happy to have been able to see both the Portland and this Toronto presentation. Can you speak more about how the idea to do installations in 2 locations came about? Each was a major undertaking. What was the generative moment where you hatched that idea and the plan?
Yeah, I think Rebecca's for sure been it since the beginning. The Toronto, for context, I guess, due to the pandemic, this showing in Toronto was meant to occur 2 years ago. And it was meant to be my undergrad thesis work. But due to the timing and how Open Studio and myself have had to adapt to the pandemic, this became the timing that it was going to happen. And a lot of that was kind of igniting that conversation with Rebecca of like, I've changed. I'm not that person anymore. And I'm doing this thesis now. So how can we work together? And Remember the Sun Baby Girl was the first print I finished. So I think that also brought a lot into conversation of like, oh, well, like this is ready to go right now. And I do want to show this body of work in this Open Studio space due to the fact that it is the most print heavy process within the work. And then same for the wallpaper. That wallpaper is not currently a big point in Toronto, as you saw, it's just on the pillar, because it is quite an intensive wallpaper to make. It's a 3-color CMYK or CMY and then trimmed down and installed. So having it have its own space, I felt really satisfied with. Because I love that wallpaper, but I knew for what was coming in Portland, everything, nothing would have a hierarchy. Like everything is on the same level in Portland. And that's really how I wanted that lived experience to feel. As instead in Toronto, I really wanted to have this moment to shine and really take this one print and expand it. So I think that's kind of the story of how these locations came to be. And then also, really acknowledging and staying true to the transnational identity that I have. You know, it's so grounding to me to be able to do my defense and know there's a part of this that's in what I would call home, in the city that I once called home. And so being able to be in that space felt really good.
Yes, funnily enough, the timing has worked out really well in a lot of ways, and hearing you talk so much about adaptability as well and your own identity as a transnational person and the artwork now having a transnational kind of geography to it at the moment, it's been really great. I have a question here from Saba. They say, I love the idea of activating a space so others can experience what you experience. Time can be restricting. I was wondering if there was anything else you would have liked to add to the installation.
Yeah, I think for the one there's a area of installation that's still very new to me, which is the floor. I understand walls and I understand prints on walls, but activating the space, how you enter it was something that, you know, just the way that the Toronto space filled up, I really didn't have to think about that. I was very satisfied with the floating idea. But then in Portland, I struggled a lot with, you know, taking it past just what's on the wall, but activating the floor space, activating the environment. And I think the living room was the space I've struggled the most with in activating. And I think it was just, you know, living rooms don't have chairs in the way that they have couches. So kind of trying to be conscious of that. And I think in a different time and like also consideration of time, we had 7 days to install in Portland, and it took 2 days to install the wallpaper and then 1 day to bring the frames in. So, and we had such like a sharp cutoff time. And I don't drive. I don't have like a lot of resources that it takes to, you know, get things. And also when you think about, I was really privileged in Toronto that for like the somewhat financial support that's done. But for your thesis, that's not the case. It's all coming out of you. So being conscious of like, what are limitations, I think also plays into like, what is the lived experience? Like, I don't have the money to put in these other elements. So I think that would be the thing I would say, like, it was the floor that I struggled with.
I think that's going to be a really interesting part to see where this work kind of grows next. And because it has started to relate, like, especially with seeing the Portland installation so much to home space, I suppose the wall here is just like a surface, and it's always really interesting to see how artists respond to it. It's almost like a blank page, but to see where you've started to kind of build in more of like a home environment to then think about how that would look in like a full gallery space or something is really interesting. And maybe I'll just wrap up if no one has a last question, just with what your plans are for the next sort of stages of your practice, if you're just wrapping up your MFA now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a few days short of being done. I'm really interested in residencies at this point. I've started to look into those a lot more deeply, and you know, also sit with research and sit with how to activate communities, what conversations can we have, and you know, I think a lot of this is like, even though it's art and it's, you know, a practice, I'm getting to that stage of like finally maybe settling down somewhere and not being so on the go. And I was really excited to kind of have this attempt at designing, let's say, an attempt at creating space and comfort. And I'm really excited to like see how that relates into what I will one day call home, because I've never had that space. And so I think that's also where the visual practice is so interesting, and just being able to like give yourself the freedom of being and seeing whatever you need to see, and seeing how that then comes into like your own space and your own home. Yeah, thanks.
Well, that was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending, of taking this time out of your day. We have more Print Speak sessions coming up, including an artist talk with Native Art Department International, who are going to be the next exhibitors in our main gallery space. So more info on that coming soon. Thanks everyone again, and enjoy the rest of your day. I hope you can get out into the sunshine if you're here in Toronto. And thanks so much to Isabel just for taking the time, putting that presentation together and putting together such a beautiful show for Open Studio.